Hello, everybody. Welcome to Verifi's webinar on Visa Stored Credentials Framework, Merchant Solutions. This webinar is being presented by Lloyd Fernandez, Director of Product here at Verifi, and it is being recorded for your future reference. Lloyd will cover the essentials of the recent change of rules for the Visa Stored Credentials Framework, and he'll provide important information on how this may affect your business and how Verifi is responding on your behalf. Prior to the conclusion of this presentation, we will be opening the forum for your questions. Questions may be submitted by the chat function at the bottom of your screen. This will be followed by a summation of the description of Verifi's implementation plans for these changes. Then we will open the forum and a final time for your guys' questions. We will now begin with Lloyd Fernandez.
Hello, everyone. This is Lloyd here, and I hope everyone's having a great day. I'm hoping everyone can hear me loud and clear. If not, just use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to let us know. So with that, I think we'll get started. What we'll cover today is kind of an overview of the requirements laid down by Visa. After we do the overview, we'll open it up for a brief kind of a discussion on what it means for everyone and what it means for the industry. After that, we'll get into a little bit more specifics into how Verifi is enabling all of this to happen, and so we can get into a little more technical detail at this point. And then we'll also talk about a self-certification process, by a means by which you can make sure that you're aligning or you're adhering to those requirements. At the end of this, we will open this up for Q&A. So that's kind of what we plan to cover today. And with no further ado, we'll jump into what this really means. So, back earlier this year, Visa mandated that we identify transactions that are processed through the network. The reason why this comes into play is mainly because of the changing face of payments. Payments is undergoing a lot of change in the sense that we see a lot many mobile wallets. We see a lot many different kind of payment methods being adopted and accepted across merchants. All of this is kind of opening it up to the fact that all of this needs to be protected in terms of fraud, in terms of how all of this is managed from a network standpoint. So, one of the possible the initiatives that we can sort of speculate is that Visa is trying to make sure that we can capture as much information as we can at the time of transaction processing. And that sort of underlies in what's being reflected as a mandate in terms of stored credentials. So if I were to define stored credentials, it essentially is the payment card number, or the PAN, which is actually the value that you would use to transact. So it could be in many different terminologies. It could also be called a payment token, right? In the world of tokenization, that's your payment token. It is also your PAN, your PAN, the primary account number, which is nothing but the credit card number. And we'll find that in all the different use cases, this particular number is either used by a customer at the point of initiating a transaction, or is used by a customer in a stored form, or could be used by a merchant on behalf of the customer. So there are like different use cases that it kind of satisfies, and we'll talk through each one of them as we provide more clarity on these requirements. So essentially, stored credentials is nothing but the credit card credentials that can be used for a single or one-time transaction, right? And it can also be used to support the cardholder within all of the different forms of payment. Now, these requirements at a high level, were, is in effect right now. It went into effect mid-October, but is not being enforced by Visa at this point in time. So, one of the primary reasons that Visa noted was a lot of the payment processors were not ready, and in terms of implementing these requirements. And so the enforcement of this new mandate has actually been pushed out to April 2018, which actually helps a lot in giving the payment processors enough time to adhere to these requirements, and also gives all of us as merchants the time to implement these requirements. So that's, in a nutshell, one of the things we've tried to stay ahead of the curve here at Verifi and try to inform our merchants as much as possible as to, what are the specific changes, which acquirers supported today and which don't. And, and as we go along, we will have a very transparent process for us to kind of keep tab on how this happens. One of the things we'll talk about as well is how, by adhering to the API specifications that we've laid out, we've decoupled any kind of risk that the acquirers have not complied with the actual requirements, meaning you can actually comply by coding to the updated specifications, and as and when the acquirer or the payment processor is ready to or has implemented these specifications, we'll pass these along to them. So in any case, we're not waiting for the last minute for these changes to get effective. So just to kind of, go a little bit more in depth, I think we, as part of stored credentials, they call it a framework on the Visa side, and this is more content that Visa has provided us in terms of giving us more clarity on these requirements. Now, they have also noted that not all transactions will fall under this category. Like, for example, if merchants end up doing a one-time sale or authorization transactions, they may not necessarily need to comply with these requirements. However, if a merchant is performing regular transactions with those credentials, or if a merchant is actually storing these credentials for use later on, then they would be under this mandate of complying to these requirements. So I think there is, just to kind of clarify, we're making sure that all of the kind of transactions that are coming across are really based on the subscription model, or like you would say, the recurring transaction model. Those are the ones that will be affected by this change. Some of the new terminology that's being introduced as part of this mandate is also who originated these transactions. Typically, as part of the network, they're only looking at these transactions or being originated from the acquirer or from the merchants. However, one of the new values that we'll be passing through the network is, was this initiated by an actual cardholder or an actual customer, or was this done on behalf of them by the merchant? So there's a cardholder initiated or merchant holder initiated nomenclature that we're sort of introducing as part of this new changes. One of the other things that we'll also do is, regardless, from your standpoint, from a merchant standpoint, if you are complying to APIs, you might want to just, do this as a blanket change for all transactions that you send to Verifi, as against having to worry about whether this is a Visa transaction or MasterCard transaction. And it just kind of helps with, reducing the amount of complexity that you might have to you might have to code on your side. So I think that's one of the other things that, as a merchant, you don't need to worry about. We'll look at some sample use cases here. And the reason why we're looking at these sample use cases essentially is because these actually talk to the emerging payment models that we see kind of rampant today, right? The first use case that you can see here is essentially a cardholder setting up their profile with their payment token for future purchases. So this may be a use case where you know you're going to be using a particular service, and you want to make sure that you just set it up and make sure you're sort of pre-authorized. In that case, you would provide these payment credentials to the merchant, and so this would be sort of a use case which is initiated by the cardholder or the customer, and it is being submitted as a stored credential, right? So Visa knows that this is a setup kind of a call for pre-authorization or for authorization of actual payment. The second use case that we have here is when a cardholder uses that stored value to make a purchase. So they go to either an online retailer or some place where, and all they're using is, instead of typing in the card credentials, they're using those credentials from what they've previously stored. So in this case, again, the cardholder is actually present at the end of the transaction. However, they're not initiating this. This is already a credential that's been stored in the network. And so all they will indicate is, I'm just using a stored credential. One of the sort of prerequisites when we do this is essentially providing the original transaction ID or the original transaction value that was used when we first triggered the storage of these credentials. The third use case that we have here is for every subsequent authorization when on behalf of the customer. So this may be kind of widely applicable to most merchants that have a recurring transaction model, where the customer actually gives you sort of the authorization to bill them periodically, every month or whatever that cycle might be. So in this case, the transactions originated by the merchant. However, you're using, again, the stored credential value, the value that the customer actually gave you to persist. In many cases, merchants either store this value on their side, or they use a payment vault to store these transactions. Regardless, it still is applicable. If you're storing this credential on your side or a payment vault, the indicator should still mean that you're using this as part of a stored value. The other use case that we have here is when a cardholder sets up the transaction for an ongoing, sort of a billing agreement. So I think this is a classic example of the cardholder sort of authorizing the transaction periodically when it comes to sort of membership. So the point being that the cardholder is actually present at this point. So the initiated by would be the cardholder, and then the stored credential is something that was previously stored in the system. These, are kind of a sort of high level, use cases that we'll sort of mostly cover. We'll walk through some of these in our API specs, so that we get a very clear sense of what use cases applies and what does not apply. The very basic takeaway from this is essentially, there are 3 additional fields that we need to supply Visa with when we do a transaction, especially when we do a recurring transaction. So anytime we're using transactions or the same credentials over and over again, we need to be able to provide some more clarity. And the other bottom line is that all of this information is useful at the time to, when it comes to chargeback prevention or any kind of fraud prevention. So they could use this information to prevent some of this down the road. Another thing that Visa has highlighted is also some of these values will be used for their account updater feature that Visa supports in the real-time sense. So there's the real-time account updater. It kind of ties into some of these pieces. So that's the other sort of the benefit of using this. Now, with this, we'll open up the forum for a few questions. Make sure you use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Just, very high level, anything about the mandate, anything about, from an overview perspective that you have a question, we can probably take a pause now for about 10 minutes and kind of go over those. And then we'll continue with the API specifications. So we have one general question is, if you use a wallet to store cards, how does this impact the vaulted card data? So the answer to this is it doesn't matter whether you use a third-party wallet or you use your own wallet or you use Verifi's wallet to store the card data. If you are actually using the recurring transactions or transactions that you use, from a subscription standpoint, you will still need to supply these additional values within the transaction calls. So I have another question. How can stored credentials feature benefit chargeback prevention? This is a very interesting question. One of the ways that we envision this to be working is also that by giving the network clarity as to who initiated these transactions, whether it was the merchant who initiated the transaction or whether it was an end customer that initiated the transaction, would be sort of beneficial to during when a chargeback is raised. So, in terms of providing, compelling evidence, this would show that the merchant initiated the transaction or the cardholder was actually present at the time of this transaction. With a lot of, stolen instruments and, a lot of the typical kind of fraud that we see, these additional values will help provide some more clarity to the network as well as, subsequently when it comes to chargeback prevention. So I hope that kind of answers the question. There's another question here. What types of payments are affected by this requirements? Is it only recurring or subscription based? So obviously the mandate states that we just need to identify the recurring or subscription based transactions. there would actually be no harm if you were doing this for all your transactions, regardless of even the network, right? If you pass these in. So one of the good things about the Verifi payment gateway is that, we abstract out even the network, right? So even if you're passing a Visa card number or a MasterCard number, our specs are abstract enough for you to provide the required information, and we can siphon off the data from what you send us to the network or to the type of transaction that we do on the back end. So in that way, it makes for a much simpler API integration on your side. Okay, if there are no other questions, I think we'll switch gear a little bit and get a little bit more technical. By the way, you're free to use the chat window at the bottom of the screen at any given point in time, and we'll just collate the questions for the end. So please don't hesitate doing that. So we, as part of our response to these new changes we've modified or updated our specs, and you should actually have a copy of these specs. If you do not have them, we'd be happy to send you a link or have you have access to these updated specs. What you see here is our updated API guide. We've introduced a whole new section that actually talks about the stored credential pieces. So I actually have the guide open right now, and let me quickly Okay, so right here, I think it's depending on the API. So we updated our real-time API as well as our batch APIs, and in both of these different interfaces, there's similar updates. So it's not it's a very standard kind of an integration. We have a section that speaks to stored credentials and what's required. We've also highlighted the similar use cases that we just walked through moments ago, but we've also provided very specific values that we're looking for. Every payment processor may have their own style in which they integrate with the Visa specs, and the advantage that we have here is we abstract all of that out from an integration standpoint. So it makes it very easy for you guys to sort of comply to these requirements. So the definition, like I mentioned earlier, we're looking at who initiated these transactions, and in our spec we actually have two values. We actually have the customer, and then we have the merchant. So these are the two values that we would use to who initiated these transactions. The second is the initial transaction ID. The reason why we need to refer the initial transaction ID is that specifically when these transactions are being used on a recurring basis or being used multiple times, we just need to know what was the original transaction ID or the previous transaction ID that was used as part of this transaction. The third value that we're looking at is what kind of stored indicator, like whether this is the first time you're actually storing the credential or you are actually using the stored credential. So that is the stored and used value that you can see over here. So the definitions really for stored is, when you're processing the initial transaction. So when you do, let's say, the $1 auth, you do the initial auth for a transaction, in which you are actually storing the customer's payment details, which is, essentially the PAN or the token, whatever that is, in the vault or any other third-party system, is that when you say it's a stored type of transaction. On the other hand, when you actually use this particular credential in a subsequent or a follow-up transaction from the customer's vault or from a third-party system, then you would invoke the value used. So those are the three new values that you actually see here. There might be other use cases, but we've tried to cover a majority or the vast, the sort of the most used use cases in this case as part of this, as part of the guide. If you have questions around a particular use case that you're not sure of, feel free to reach out to us and reach out to your relationship manager with a specific question, and we'll be able to help you sort of identify what kind of values need to pass through. I would say for the vast majority of use cases, the ones that we've illustrated in our API docs should be well covered. I'm gonna scroll up a little bit just to kind of give you a sense of the actual API changes. So what you see here are what's applicable in a sale or an authorization transaction only. So we don't really need any of these values at the time of a refund or any other kind of transactions, only required at the time of a sale or an authorization. On this page, you can see that the initiated by is an alphanumeric value, which indicates customer merchant, and that's something that you can identify with. Initial transaction ID can be blank in cases where you don't have an original transaction ID. Or if you do have an original transaction ID, you would supply that as part of the initial transaction ID value. And then your stored credential indicator is something that you would pass as stored or used. And that's a literal string. So those are the three values that you would pass through. The same exact thing would apply when it comes to your batch APIs. In a batch mode, typically, depending on the file format, we will either create a new file format that has these three values, and after you sort of test the new batch file format, you can start sending data using the new batch file format. So that's kind of one of the ways that you can sort of transition over from the current spec to the updated spec. So it's a very simple change to the API, but I can understand sort of the logic behind some of this, right? So again, if you have questions around that, we're open to having that discussion, and especially if you have specific use cases that are not necessarily called out over here. We'll switch over really quickly to the slide, basically saying that there are there are multiple guides that we've updated. One of the ways to make sure that these changes take effect and they don't affect your existing transaction is to go through a self-certification kind of a phase where you would make these changes in a particular version of the APIs, and send a few live transactions through those transactions. I say live transactions. You don't necessarily have to send customer data. You could use your test card data that you normally would use in the live environment, and send the new data through. We will validate with the processors and make sure that all of this data is being passed through. Once you have confirmation that everything goes through, you are free to sort of migrate to the new updated API specs. So we're here to help you, strategize your upgrade path or your certification path as well, and kind of help this make this transition really smooth. With that, I really, unless there's more they want to cover, we can open this forum up to a Q&A, a general Q&A section. And, we can talk about any other concerns or any other specific details that we might be able to address at this point in time. Okay, so we do have a few questions, and I'll just kind of go in the order that's been received. So one of the questions is, what is a stored credential indicator? So let me explain this with this guide. And what you see in the guide here is a value in the API spec. It's a stored credential indicator, and it essentially is telling the network that this is a stored value or it's a used value. So credentials references the payment type or the payment, if it's a payment token or a PAN. Stored credential essentially references the fact that this credential was used because it was used as part of storage by the merchant or by a third-party wallet, right? So that's the indicator that needs to kind of come across. So stored credential indicator is essentially an indicator to let the network know whether this was freshly initiated by the customer, or it was initiated as a result of storage, either at the merchant end or at the at any other third party. Hopefully that explains it. Feel free to kind of follow up with a question if that's not clear enough. The other question I have is the original transaction ID the same as the gateway transaction ID we get now, or a Visa transaction ID? That's another great question, and the answer is that it is the same exact gateway transaction ID that you use today. So every time you reference the original transaction ID, you're going to use that same transaction ID, not the Visa transaction ID. It's a transaction ID that Verifi gives you, and you use it for every subsequent transaction. So yes, it is not the Visa transaction ID. I see another comment here. So I'm hoping that you were able to see the slides, but if you were not, I think we'll send out a link to this webinar, and you should be able to see the slides. I'm sorry that it took forever to load, but I think I was trying to make it very kind of simple in the explanations as well. So I'm hoping that was beneficial. But if not, we will definitely send you a link to the slide deck, as well as an email that you can contact us at any time. So I have another question. What is the purpose of the initial transaction ID? the underlying purpose for the initial transaction ID that Visa requires essentially is they want to pair up the originally authenticated or the originally authorized transaction with the recurring transaction, and that way they know that this is in accordance with the subscription thing that the customer's already been provided, or it's out of band or whatever. So I think it's more to kind of link these transactions up at the network level, as against it being only at the the gateway level or the processor level. So that's sort of the underlying piece over there. Another question is, how does this impact chargeback processing, if at all? So one of the, like I mentioned earlier, one of the sort of the advantages of this is by collecting some of this information up front from the merchant, we're giving Visa enough information, or rather, just enough as much as they're asking for, to connect the dots. So if there was a chargeback that came up subsequently through the network would be able to identify that this particular transaction was actually originated by the customer, and the original transaction ID was X or Y, whatever that was. And it was, so it would be able to fend off any kind of, information related to fraud or, any kind of chargebacks that are being raised on that particular transaction. So I can't necessarily say that this is, how it's all interrelated, but I think this is something that Visa has sort of, laid out as one of the reasons for them asking for this additional information. So we're kind of, just making sure we sort of comply, and by virtue of that, by that compliance, we're able to help them reduce, chargebacks that could potentially be avoided. Okay, I have another question. What does this ultimately mean for a merchant that uses the gateway with several payment processors and acquirer accounts? Okay, another great question. So really, it's a very simple, a very simple change when it comes to Verifi merchants, right? All we're asking you guys to do is update to the latest version of the spec and provide the additional information as and when applicable, right? So depending on your use case, what kind of values need to come through. So if you sort of comply to those requirements, Verifi merchants have the advantage of not having to worry about the different payment processors and the different acquirer accounts, because in the given time frame that Visa has prescribed, all or most of these payment processors will start complying with these new regulations. So you do not have to wait for your particular acquirer or your particular payment processor to have complied for you to make these changes. You could literally start making these changes today and start complying with these requirements. If your acquirer or your processor is not yet ready, the day they're ready, they'll start seeing some of these changes come through to them. So we're kind of decoupling the risk that you might actually have if you hinge these, if you delay this because the processor is not ready. Our commitment is to essentially work with all the processors and make sure that they all comply, or basically make sure that they're all in compliance. As an alternate, you can also reach out to your processor directly and say, guys, we're making these changes and all of this, and we want to make sure that all of this happens. So you can also have that sort of conversation or with your individual processors if you want to. But we're there to kind of help you through this change by making sure that we work with all of these processes and have them sort of ready to go in time for the new enforcement timeline. Okay, with that, I'll go to the next question. It says, can you send a transaction ID fused at one merchant to another merchant? So I'm not really sure of this question, and I may have to defer this at right now unless you want to clarify this a little bit more. But from what I'm understanding, okay, there is a clarification question, my bad. Okay, it says, can you send a transaction ID used at one merchant processor to another merchant processor? So this is, again, another interesting question. And I'm assuming what is meant by this is if you do the initial authorization, right, using one merchant processor, and then follow up with recurring transactions on a different merchant processor, if both of those merchant processors do not support this new requirement, then we have a problem. However, if you do send assuming that they both support this requirement, the transaction ID that's passed along, and you in a different given points in time, they get processed by different processors for whatever reason. Visa should still be able to get those indicators, right? So these indicators are ultimately being leveraged at the network level, right? So it's not really at the processor level. The processor merely enables these values to get through to Visa. So whichever way they do it is immaterial as long as we're sending these values over to Visa. So I guess sort of to answer this question a little better, if you were using processor A and processor B, and let's say you did your initial transaction with processor A, and you told processor A that this is customer initiated, this is a stored credential, and you give all that information. All that information goes to Visa. Visa knows that this particular payment credential was used in light of these parameters. Later on, when you do a subsequent recurring transaction a few months later or whenever, you use a different processor to send that same information, you're basically telling Visa that, oh, this is a stored credential, by the way, and it is done on behalf of the customer, and here's the previous transaction ID. So it should not really matter as a verified merchant. You should just be using your original transaction ID regardless of which processor this ends up going through. So I hope that made sense. I know it's one of those use cases that only Verifi can has the ability because of our dynamic routing capabilities. So it is definitely a sort of a use case that we kind of specialize in. So it's a great question, and I hope my explanation sort of helped. So we'll move on to the next question. What changes are needed, if any, in upfront marketing to consumers? So I think one of the underlying, I wouldn't say change, but this is something that as a merchant, based on the products that you sell, you are already sort of informing your customers that you are actually storing these credentials, or you're having them enter it at any given point in time, you're making them aware upfront that that the first time they use the transaction, we're going to be storing it for future use. So if you're anyways doing that, there is no real change that you need to sort of communicate to consumers. However, if that's not the case, or you haven't been doing any of those kind of best practices when it comes to a subscription kind of a transaction, at that point, I think the underlying piece would be that you do inform them that these credentials are being stored, by you or by whatever entity. Kind of give them a little more sort of friendlier message saying that we will use this periodically every month based on our contract or whatever that is. So I think there is no real change from a consumer point of view or a customer point of view unless you are not doing those already today, right? So that's kind of how I would look at that change. If you have concerns around how you're doing it today, and if you'd like to review that with us, I think we're more than happy to sort of have that conversation. Feel free to reach out to us, and we can help you, kind of sort of guide you in how you might want to position that if you do want to go down the route and make those changes. I do have a few other kind of questions, a little more API specific, and I'll kind of go over these as well. So one of the things that we also do as part of the Verifi spec is we have a field in our the merchant defined fields. We have a field which is the level of continuity, which essentially explains whether this is a recurring transaction and whether it's the first time, it's a trial, that kind of thing, and how that ties into these requirements. And for very good reasons, we've actually kept those separate from these requirements, just because what we use the LOC for is essentially for internal Verifi processing and helping us sort of do all kinds of rule-based logic and things like that. This is not something that we actually send out to the network, and so we're decoupling or not necessarily using the MDF2 field in combination with the new fields that we're introducing. So they're two separate pieces of information, and they're used kind of separately. So yeah, using one does not impact the other, and vice versa. So another question, and I'm not sure if I talked about this earlier, is what happens if we do not pass the data? Will the transaction still process? And the second subsequent thing is, are there penalties assessed by Visa? Now, so let's assume we do not pass this data. Basically, the transactions will still process based on the information that you provide. As you can see in all of our specifications, these are not required fields. They're all optional values. However, this enhances the nature of the transaction. So not passing the data it basically means that we're not complying with some of these requirements, especially when it comes to Visa transactions. And we don't exactly know if there's any kind of penalties associated with this. I mean, this is something that I would encourage you to talk to your processors as well, to kind of figure out what's the implications of you not passing this data to them. We do know that in light of everything that Visa is trying to do, they would sort of encourage you to send this information, and so we think it might get tied to something else as well. So we want to make sure that we do everything in our capability to comply with these. However, we're not certain at this point of how this whether this would negatively impact you. Okay, I have another question, and the question is about the virtual terminal feature that we have on the gateway. And it says, will the new fields be added to the virtual terminal? And the answer to that would be yes. We would have those supported on the virtual terminal. I am not 100% sure at this point whether that's already active, but I can follow up with you on that. That is something that I can confirm when that will be supported. So that's another great question. So some of the other questions that I have here is, can Verifi give us some guidance on the information that Visa is requiring to be displayed on the website? We'll kind of address this question to a certain degree. We can definitely provide some guidance, but like I just said, it's not a drastic change from what you're already probably doing in terms of best practices of informing your customer. Visa just requires you to do that, but they don't necessarily mandate the exact verbiage or the exact instructions of what you're supposed to say, because typically you're addressing more than Visa's needs, right? You're addressing MasterCard and all the other networks and all of the other things. So you would be doing that in kind of keeping your customers more informed, regardless of what Visa says. But it's kind of best practice to follow that. So the next question is, the new required information is only required on recurring payment transactions, but we need to configure our systems to pass this data on all transactions. Yes. So what we're saying is that to make this really clean and simple, you would pass this additional information on all transactions you send to us, regardless whether it's Visa or MasterCard. You just send it all through, regardless of whether it is one time or recurring. You would send it through just to kind of keep a very simple model on your side. We will do the heavy lifting on our side and make sure that we send these out to the processors that are ready to consume these, as well as we will abstract out what kind of information needs to go through those processors. So every processor has a very different way or a very different style of implementing these, and as much as we don't have to worry about those, right? You just comply with these, and to keep it simple, just send in regardless of what types of transactions or what type of networks you're trying to process. The one last question that I have so far is, if we want to go to the spec now and a processor is not ready, what happens to those transactions? Would they fail in some way? No. So the transactions would not fail if the processor is not ready. It's just that the processor is not capable of consuming those transactions. So since these are all optional fields, the transactions would process the way it does today or the way it did yesterday. It'll do the same way tomorrow, even if they're not ready. But the moment they're ready, we'll be able to feed in this extra information that they can sort of use to enhance sort of the transaction value. Okay, another question. This is another interesting one. How does this affect the historical recurring transactions? So this is a good one, because obviously you have established customers who've been sort of using these transactions for a period of time, right? And so one of the ways to deal with something like this would be you would continue to say the very first time you process it through the new sort of framework would be, say, this is a stored credential, right? Or you could continue to say that this is a a used credential, meaning you've already stored this initially, and all you're doing is you're using these transactions going forward. So from a historical standpoint, you will just kind of fall in line with what you would do today, right? So you would continue to process these transactions and say, this is credentials that's already stored in our systems, and we're just processing them as stored credentials, as against saying, oh, we're going to store this now and then process it. So nothing should, it should be no different than as you would process transactions going forward, no matter whether it's a historical transactions or they're a brand new signups by the customer. So I think we're almost on the hour, and I might be able to take one more question if there is one. But if not, I just want to kind of make sure that our commitment to merchants or to you guys is to make sure that you are well informed, and in case there's a question or in case there's a clarification about what we discussed today, or feel free to kind of reach out to your relationship manager or email, whatever works, and we'll be happy to sort of respond as quickly as possible.
Perfect. Well, thank you everybody for joining Verifi's presentation. In case you missed anything, we'll be sending out a link later this week to the recording of today's presentation for your future reference. And thanks again for joining us.